Elena Moritz had always believed that science was meant to serve humanity. At 35, she had devoted more than a decade of her life to chemical research, pushing the boundaries of medicinal chemistry with relentless determination. Her small laboratory at the University of Leiden was her sanctuary, a place of white walls, the faint smell of ethanol, and the quiet hum of machines. For years, she worked tirelessly on a single goal: creating a drug that could regenerate damaged cells and reverse the progress of diseases that, until now, had been considered incurable. And one rainy November morning, she finally succeeded. The vial on her lab table contained a translucent liquid, faintly glowing under the fluorescent light. She had named it Regenera, a compound capable of repairing cellular DNA and reactivating dormant repair mechanisms in the body. In lab tests, it had reversed the effects of degenerative nerve disease in rats within days. In human trials, carefully supervised, small-scale, and entirely legal, it had saved the lives of terminal patients. It was the discovery of a lifetime. But good news doesn't travel in a straight line, it passes through politics first. Within weeks, Elena's work had caught the attention of government health regulators. At first, she expected collaboration, funding, and support. Instead, she was summoned to a meeting in The Hague, where 5 stone-faced officials in suits sat across from her in a sterile conference room. "We've reviewed your research," the man in the middle said, his voice slow and deliberate. "While your results are promising, the release of such a treatment poses significant economic risks. Current treatments for chronic illnesses account for billions in revenue each year. Replacing them overnight would disrupt the pharmaceutical market, cause job losses, and destabilize the health sector." Elena blinked, trying to process the absurdity. "So you're saying, curing people is bad for the economy?" The woman to his right smiled thinly. "We are saying that abrupt change can be dangerous. We are placing your work under government review. Effective immediately, you're to halt all independent testing." It felt like a slap. Years of work, frozen in the space of a few sentences. At first, Elena tried to fight back, appealing to the university board, contacting ethical committees, even reaching out to journalists. But every time she made a move, something blocked her path. A critical document went missing from her files. A smear article appeared in a major paper, suggesting her results were inconclusive, and her trials unethical. Funding from private donors evaporated overnight. Then came the threats, subtle at first, but unmistakable. One evening, returning home from the lab, she found her apartment door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was stolen, but her research notes had been moved. A week later, her car brakes failed on a wet road, sending her spinning into a ditch. The police report called it an unfortunate mechanical failure. Elena knew better. By January, it was clear she couldn't stay in Leiden. Packing up what she could, hard drives, lab notebooks, a few clothes, she moved to a remote coastal town in northern Scotland. It was a windswept, isolated place where sea cliffs met grey skies and the wind howled through narrow streets. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town and turned the spare room into a makeshift lab. She thought she could work quietly here, away from the reach of those who wanted her silenced. But even here, the long arm of power found her. Packages of lab equipment went missing in transit. A local supplier refused to sell her basic chemicals after receiving official warnings. Anonymous letters slipped under her door, warning her to stop. Her isolation grew heavier each day. The town was friendly enough, but she kept to herself, afraid to endanger anyone else. Nights were the worst, lying awake, listening to the wind batter the walls, wondering if someone might break in. It was on one of those nights, while she was walking along the cliff path to clear her head, that she met him. He was standing at the edge of the cliff, sketching the landscape in a worn leather notebook. A tall man in his late 30s, with dark hair pulled back loosely and eyes that seemed to study everything at once. He noticed her before she could pass quietly by. "Cold night for a walk," he said, closing his notebook. "I needed some air," Elena replied, her voice cautious. He smiled faintly. "Me too. I'm Daniel Ross. I'm a materials scientist. Moved here a few months ago to work on renewable polymers." "And you?" Elena hesitated. Revealing too much could be dangerous. But something in his tone, calm, unassuming, made her answer honestly. "Chemist. Working on a medical project." The conversation was brief, but something about it stayed with her. Over the next weeks, they ran into each other again, at the small grocery store, at the harbor, along the cliff path. Gradually, she told him more: the cure, the government interference, the threats. She expected disbelief or polite dismissal. Instead, Daniel listened intently, his jaw tightening as she spoke. "They can't just bury something like that," he said one evening, his voice sharp with conviction. "If you've really got a working cure, it needs to be out there." "They've made sure I can't," she said bitterly. "Every time I try, they shut me down." "Then maybe," he said slowly, "you just need a different approach. And someone to watch your back." It was the first time in months that Elena felt a spark of hope. But neither of them knew just how far the people against her were willing to go, and that their alliance had just painted a target on both their backs. The days in the Scottish coastal town passed with an odd mix of peace and tension. On the surface, life moved slowly. The tide rolled in and out, gulls wheeled above the harbor, fishermen mended nets by hand. But beneath the calm, Elena felt the undercurrent of danger. Every time she stepped outside, she found herself scanning the street, checking for unfamiliar cars, faces she didn't recognize. Daniel became her anchor in this uneasy world. His rented workshop was only a short walk from her cottage, a converted boathouse filled with strange machines, coils of tubing, and stacks of notebooks. They began meeting almost every day, sharing coffee and ideas. She taught him the core principles behind Regenera, and he explained how certain materials could help stabilize fragile compounds for long-term storage. It wasn't long before their workspaces began to merge. Half of Elena's spare room became dedicated to polymer research. Half of Daniel's boathouse was given over to advanced chemistry equipment. They worked late into the night, the sound of the wind rattling the windows while they debated formulas and tested prototypes. For a while, it felt almost normal, as if the outside world had forgotten them. But then the messages started. At first, they were emails from anonymous accounts. Short sentences like, "We know where you are," or "Stop before it's too late." Then came the letters, thick paper envelopes without return addresses, slipped under the door or taped to the cottage gate. Some were written in neat type, others scrawled in messy handwriting. All carried the same warning: stop. Daniel wanted to go to the police, but Elena shook her head. "They'll just dismiss it as a prank. Or worse, they'll notify the same people who want me silent." Instead, they doubled down on their work. Every step forward, however small, felt like a victory. But victories in science are rarely invisible. One rainy evening, after weeks of refining the formula, they achieved a breakthrough: a stable, portable version of Regenera that could survive unrefrigerated for months. It was exactly what they needed to bypass the logistical bottlenecks the authorities would use as an excuse to delay release. They celebrated with takeaway fish and chips, eating by the warm glow of the lab light. Daniel was halfway through explaining a new idea for large-scale synthesis when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up outside. They froze. It was late, and hardly anyone visited the cottage after dark. Elena crept to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to peek through. A black SUV sat idling on the narrow road, its windows tinted. No one got out. "Don't turn on any more lights," Daniel whispered. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. The SUV finally rolled away, disappearing into the fog. That night, neither of them slept. The next morning, they agreed on one thing: they needed allies. Not just scientists. People who could help them get the cure out into the world without going through official channels. Daniel reached out to a few old contacts from his university days, people who'd moved into tech and logistics. Elena tried an encrypted message to a former patient's family, one she trusted deeply, explaining only that she needed help distributing something important. It was a risk, and risks have a way of attracting consequences. 2 days later, the first break-in happened. Elena returned from town to find the back door hanging open. Inside, the place was a mess, drawers pulled out, papers scattered. At first, she feared her research was gone, but the main hard drive was still hidden in its usual place behind a loose panel in the wall. Whoever had broken in hadn't found it, or had deliberately left it to avoid alerting her. The police came, took notes, and left with sympathetic but unconcerned expressions. "Probably some kids," the officer said. Elena didn't bother arguing. That night, Daniel moved in temporarily, sleeping on the couch. They took turns staying awake, one working while the other kept watch. The air between them grew heavier, not just with fear but with a quiet, unspoken connection. There were moments when their hands brushed over a shared notebook, or when a look held too long said more than words could. Still, the work came first. One stormy evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Daniel finally voiced what they'd both been avoiding. "Elena, if we keep going like this, they'll eventually find us. And when they do, they won't just take your research. They'll take us." She looked at him, the lamplight casting shadows across his face. "So what do you suggest?" "We go on the offensive," he said simply. "We stop waiting for them to strike and make our move first." He explained his plan. They would replicate Regenera in multiple secret labs, working with trusted contacts scattered across Europe. Each lab would hold only part of the formula, so even if one was compromised, the cure couldn't be destroyed. Then, they'd release the full formula online, open source, in a way that couldn't be traced back to them. It was bold, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the only plan that could work. Elena hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Let's do it." Over the next month, their lives became a blur of codenames, encrypted calls, and midnight courier runs. They smuggled tiny vials across ferry terminals, disguised shipments as art supplies, and met contacts in noisy train stations where the crowd provided cover. Every success felt like one step closer to freedom, but also one step deeper into danger. One night, returning from a delivery in Aberdeen, they found the cottage door forced open again. This time, nothing was taken, but on the kitchen table sat a single object. A burnt matchstick, standing upright in a small pool of wax. A warning. Daniel's jaw clenched. "They're saying the clock is ticking." Elena touched the matchstick with trembling fingers. "Then we need to move faster." By early spring, the network was nearly ready. They had 5 partial labs running, each managed by someone they trusted. The final step was to assemble the complete formula in one secure location, make the digital files, and set the release plan in motion. But even as they planned, Elena couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched more closely than ever. She saw the same black SUV twice in the same week. Daniel noticed a man with a camera loitering near the harbor. And then came the call, a voice she didn't recognize, calm and cold. "You're running out of time, Dr. Moritz. Stop now, or there will be consequences you can't undo." The line went dead. She turned to Daniel. "They know. They're getting ready to make their move." He nodded grimly. "So are we." And somewhere, beyond the crashing waves and the safety of their small coastal refuge, the storm that had been building for months was finally about to break. The gale arrived just after midnight, a wall of rain crossing the sea like moving glass. Wind hammered the eaves of the cottage and rattled the old sash windows until the panes hummed. Elena sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the wood, watching the kettle shudder across a ring of steam. Daniel leaned in the doorway, sleeves rolled, the blue of a night light turning his face the color of water. "We can't wait any longer," he said. Marek's lab in Prague went dark. Her head lifted sharply. "When?" "An hour ago." He got one word out on the emergency channel, "visitors." Then static. Daniel rubbed his forehead, breathing through his teeth. "If they have him, they'll squeeze. Even if he only held a fragment, they'll try to map the network." Elena's stomach went cold. Marek wasn't just a node, he was a friend. He'd taken risks for her when she still believed she could fight the system by email and committee report. "We should shut everything down," she said. "Scatter. Wait a month. And lose momentum?" Daniel shook his head. "They've escalated. We have to move the assembly up." He went to the whiteboard tacked to the pantry door. Lines connected names and cities, arrows curling between courier routes. The center of the web was a small circle labeled with a word only they used for the meeting point: lighthouse. Elena stared at it. "Are you sure about the lighthouse?" "It's as good as we're going to get, off the tourist maps, robust power, a backup uplink, and 1,000 ways out if we're forced to run." He hesitated. "Iona is ready to host." The name untied a knot inside her. Iona Ramsey had retired early from the National Cybersecurity Agency, bought a defunct fog station on a rocky outcropping 2 hours north, and filled it with radios, batteries, and stubbornness. She owed Daniel a favor. She owed no one else anything. Elena nodded once, the decision settling like a coin dropping to the bottom of a well. "We go at dawn." They packed in the pre-dawn half-light. Books. Vials sealed inside foam. The encrypted drives wrapped in a childishly cheerful tea towel, Daniel's idea of camouflage. When Elena carried the hard case to the door, she paused and looked back. The cottage had been a refuge, a breathing space between battles. Now it looked like a stage after the actors leave. Chairs turned in, an empty cup, a coat slung across a hook. "Ready?" Daniel asked softly. She shut the door with a click that sounded too final. "Ready." They drove north along a single-track road that stitched the cliffs to the sea. The sky lightened, lavender, then ash, then a bruised blue that meant more rain on the way. At a cut in the rocks, Daniel turned inland. A lane tunneled through gorse and bracken, opening at last on a low building hunkered against the wind. The lighthouse itself, white, squat, stood like a threat against the horizon. A woman in a waxed jacket was waiting on the steps, hair whipping her face. "Iona," Daniel called, and the woman lifted a hand, impatience and relief fighting in her eyes. "Took your time," she said, but her grip on Elena's arm was warm. Inside, quickly. The fog station smelled faintly of salt and solder. A bank of monitors showed the sea in 4 directions, the yard, the one-lane approach. Heavy shutters could slide across the windows at the touch of a button. Elena let herself inhale fully for the first time in days. "You weren't followed," Iona said, as if willing it to be true. "We've swept the approach twice. Leave the cases there." They laid out the fragments in Iona's radio room. Each piece of Regenera, the synthesis pathway, the folding simulations, the stabilizer matrix, the delivery shell, the ethical protocol for trials, was stored in a different cipher, a different hand. Only Elena held the core binding key in her memory, the prime that would let the shards resolve into a whole. Daniel set up the uplink to their distribution plan. A constellation of servers and data caches, a half-dozen public repositories ready to accept a preprint and a set of open designs. More quietly, a handful of health cooperatives and clinics had agreed to mirror the files the second they went live. "Dead man switch?" Iona asked. "Running," Daniel said. "If we lose power or neither of us checks in for 6 hours, the package seeds from 3 directions we don't control." Iona's mouth twitched. "That will make them angry." "Angry is honest," Elena murmured. They worked for hours, the hiss of the kettle and the sea their metronome. Midday came and went. Rain drew chalk lines down the windows. Elena's fingers shook once, only once, as she traced the memory of the binding key through old dread and newer resolve. She entered it blindfolded, at Daniel's insistence, in case a camera was somewhere they hadn't found. Nearby, he handled the logistics with a competence that made fear less loud. When the fragments locked, it was not dramatic. The screen flashed a single word, coherent, and a timestamp. Elena's breath hitched anyway. Months of division had resolved into unity. On the monitor, the formula stood like a cathedral. "Time to generate the public files," Daniel said softly. "And the recipes for the co-ops." He used the word recipes on purpose, intelligible, human. Not everyone they were arming would be a chemist at Elena's level. The public release would be descriptive and rigorous, enough for teams worldwide to replicate and improve the compound. The clinic version would be practical without crossing into the territory of dangerous shortcuts. Elena kept a tight rein on the details. No one would be able to produce Regenera in a garage. No one would hurt themselves by misreading a line. "You're still a cautious radical," Iona said. It sounded like a compliment. By dusk, the files were ready, the cryptographic signatures embedded, the hash list printed 3 times and placed in separate envelopes. Iona rigged a second uplink, a long, thin antenna that made the fog station look like a listening creature. The release window was set for 48 hours later, just long enough to alert a small circle of journalists and physicians who would vouch for the science the minute it appeared. Elena sent one last signal, a simple message to a single contact: "Soon. Be ready to speak." It went to the daughter of one of her earliest trial participants. The woman had promised to tell the story of a father who had lost his tremors and regained his handwriting, if Elena ever asked. They ate in the kitchen like a family too tired to be formal. Iona told a story about a botched surveillance operation in the old days, how a seagull had ruined months of planning by stealing a microphone. Elena laughed for the first time in what felt like years. The laugh turned to a cough, then to silence. Daniel set his cup down. "We're not safe," he said into the quiet. "Not yet." Iona nodded, eyes on the feed from the lane. "I know." The first car appeared at midnight. It was audacious, a white van with a municipal logo that would have been plausible anywhere else. But out here, 2 hours north of anything, no one came at night except wind and weather. The van stopped just out of sight of the cameras, as if it knew where they were. A man in a high-visibility jacket got out and stood in the rain, looking at nothing. Iona dimmed the lights. Daniel shut down anything that wasn't essential. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, a bird trapped behind her ribs. "Hold," Iona said. "Let's see if we have friends." 2 more vehicles slid into view, black, unmarked, their engines quiet as a threat. The men who stepped out moved like they belonged to someone who practiced ownership as a creed. Elena's mouth went dry. "They found us." "Of course they did," Iona said. "You don't build a lighthouse to hide." She pressed a switch. Steel shuttered the ground-level windows. "But you do build it to endure." They knocked first. Polite. The sound of knuckles on metal rang through the bones of the place. No one answered. The knocking became a fist. The fist became a crowbar. The crowbar became a battering ram. Iona's voice was steady. "Protocol whiskey." Daniel moved without looking at Elena. He knew what she would say. She didn't waste the air saying it. "Protocol whiskey. Split, delay, misdirect, preserve the core." Elena took the case with the vials and the envelopes. Daniel took the drives. Iona took the uplink keys. They ran 3 different directions through a building built for it: old route for keepers, newer catwalks, a maintenance shaft that smelled of oil and childhood dares. The first breach felt like a shiver underfoot. Shouts. The iron odor of wet gear. Elena slid down a ladder and landed in a storage room, lungs on fire. She pressed a palm to the door and felt footsteps on the other side. She closed her eyes, counting to steady herself. She had been brave when no one demanded it. She would be brave now that the world did. A hand touched her shoulder. She almost struck before Daniel's breath cut the fear in half. "Left," he whispered. "The storm culvert. It empties into the sea. We meet at the cleft." The cleft? She swallowed. It was a narrow seam in the cliff face, a place local boys used to climb and dare. "In this weather?" "In this weather," he said. "No one sane will follow. I'm not sure we qualify." But she nodded. They ran. Behind them, metal gave way to force. Ahead, the life cycle of water, drip, trickle, roar, drew them to a half-height tunnel that coughed brine. Daniel dropped first, then turned and reached his arms up, bracing himself. Elena lowered the case by its strap and slid after it. Seawater clawed at her ankles, the cold bit straight to the marrow. They crawled until the culvert spat them into a chaos of rock and spray. The sea was teeth. The night condensed into wet and wind. And there, black on black, the cleft, a V in the cliff just above the froth. They hauled themselves up one handhold at a time, ungraceful and ferocious. At the top, a heath opened like a breath. For a moment Elena could see everything. The lighthouse crouched against the weather, small figures moving like damp shadows, the van's lights making a milky pool. And then the night took it back. Iona met them at a tangle of wind bushes, hair plastered to her head, eyes sparking. "You 2 head for the bothy," she said, thrusting the uplink dongle into Daniel's hand. "It's marked, Shepherd's Hut, on old maps. I'll lead them to the quarry and lose them." "You can't outrun," Daniel began. "Who said anything about outrun?" Iona's grin was swift and sharp. "Go." She vanished into the gorse like a fox. Daniel tugged Elena's wrist, and they ran. The ground was soaked and springy. Twice Elena slid and went to her knees, the case dragging at her shoulder, but each time Daniel was there, not a rescuer. A companion whose weight on her elbow said, "We rather than you." They didn't speak until the bothy appeared. A low stone rectangle that smelled of peat and old bread. Inside, it was dark, dry, and according to the last survey Iona had sent them, invisible unless you already intended to find it. Daniel closed the door and stood there, chest heaving, the uplink dongle clutched in his fist like a prayer. Elena dropped the case and began to shake. Not delicate tremors, deep, shuddering waves that made speech impossible. Daniel knelt and took her hands in both of his, steady pressure on bone. "You did everything right," he said. "You got the heart out." "They'll hurt her," she managed. "For helping us." "They'll try," he said. "But she trained them first." He pressed his forehead briefly to hers, a point of heat in a world gone to salt. "We have to keep moving." They waited an hour, because sprinting blindly would be worse. Daniel used the time to whistle together a handset from pieces he'd carried like smuggled seeds. Elena wrote 3 sentences on a scrap of paper, then burned it in the bothy's stove, breathing the smoke like an oath. When he looked at her again, his face was different. Not softer. Clarified. Elena, he said. He never called her by her surname in private. I know this isn't the time. Maybe there isn't one. But if something happens, if we don't. She shook her head once, warning and permission at the same time. He swallowed. You matter to me. Not because of the work. Not because of the fight. Because when the world proved itself unkind, you refused to become smaller. Her laugh was a ragged thing, but it was real. You choose your moments terribly. I'm a materials guy. Timing isn't in my field. She leaned forward and kissed him, brief and fierce, salt on salt. Now it is, she said. Now we go. They headed inland, moving by contour and memory, avoiding the road. Near dawn, they reached a lay-by where a rust-colored hatchback sat under a film of pine needles. Iona's doing. The keys were under the driver's mat. A note on the dash read, in a hand that almost looked bored, they think you ran south. Don't. East. Radio quiet for 24. Below it, an asshole's smiley face. They drove east, not south, to a ferry that cut the world into before and after. When they made landfall, they bought second-hand jackets and 2 disposable phones from a shop that sold garden tools and gossip. The phones stayed off. They swapped the hatchback for a different color of hatchback. At a hostel, Elena stood under a shower so hot it hurt and cried without sound. By the second night, they were in Edinburgh, then out of it, then through an airport under names that wouldn't take a second glance. Elena's passport said she was a language teacher. Daniel said his profession was blank. Their bags held only clothes, the drives, the vials, and a small photograph Elena had slipped into her pocket without thinking. The first patient to hold a pen without shaking. As they boarded the plane, Daniel bent close. Brussels first, then Lisbon. Lisbon is crucial. Because of Rui, she said. Because of Rui, he agreed. Rui Leal ran a cooperative lab with a talent for turning principles into practice. He had also, more importantly, designed the piece of their plan that ensured no single government could quarantine the truth. It was Rui who had suggested embedding their release in a cascade. A legal preprint, a plain language dossier, a mirrored set of designs anchored in community servers, and, quietly, a set of seeds disguised in the metadata of public images. If one root choked, another would breathe. On the flight, Elena slept with her head against the window. She dreamed of shorelines drawn in equations, of doors that opened to other doors. She woke to the soft insistence of landing gear and the ache of an unasked question. How much will this cost? In Brussels, a woman with a canvas bag met them at a café whose floor tiles were black and white chevrons. Her name was Anika Bose. She practiced law in the cracks where the law tried to look away. She spoke very little. Everything about her was efficient. They will claim you are thieves, Anika said, sliding them each a small folder. They will say you misused public funds, injured people, endangered lives. They will use the word terror with cunning grammar. Your best defense is timing. Release first. Explain second. Prove third. Do you believe us? Elena asked. Annika's eyes flicked up, quick as a match. I believe power patterns. I also believe in a man in Leuven who stood up from a wheelchair 6 months ago and now walks his dog too far. He used a name that is not yours. But he used your molecule. She closed the folders. Be careful whom you trust, Dr. Moritz. One of your Brussels contacts isn't yours anymore. The betrayal revealed itself that evening over Friet and Rain. Daniel's old classmate, Leif Vanner, who had helped route messages through university networks, arrived with the wrong sort of posture. He smiled with his mouth, not his face. When he hugged Daniel, his elbow pressed too deliberately against Daniel's side. A bump, small enough to be nothing. A tracker, just big enough to mean everything. They left separately, as if to digest dinner. 2 streets later, Daniel pulled the device from his jacket seam and tucked it into the pocket of a passing courier's bag with a murmured apology. He and Elena turned into a crowd. The men following them turned into the tracker and a courier making good time toward a different quarter of the city. Rui met them in Lisbon in a room that smelled of citrus and solder. His lab was a dream made practical. Tables scarred by use, a notice board crowded with careful, kind rules. He hugged Elena too long, then stepped back and wiped his eyes without shame. I have everything ready, he said. Power tested. Redundancies on redundancies. The cascade will start when you breathe on it. He tapped a key and showed them a simulation. Nodes lighting like stars, then constellations, then daylight. But I need your breath. They worked for a day and a night. Outside, the city sang, the sound of a tram bell, the squeal of a chair across tile, children racket ballooning through an alley. Inside, the four of them, Elena, Daniel, Rui, and a quiet woman named B who kept watch, built a ladder out of light. Halfway through the second night, Rui's face went strange. "We have a problem," he said without looking up. "Someone is seeding a false Regenera packet to the same repositories. If it lands first, it will poison the well. When yours arrives, they will say it matches the fake and is therefore false." Classic technique. "Who?" Daniel snapped. Rui's mouth pulled to one side. "Address originates from a research park in." He stopped and looked at Elena. "The Hague." Her throat tightened at the name. "Home territory weaponized. Counter?" she asked. 2. Rui's hands danced. "We timestamp with a public blockchain you've already used for your lab notebooks. Their immutability proves ancestry. And we tether to testimony. I asked 3 clinics to be ready with sworn statements about outcomes that can't have come from a fiction." He looked at Elena with a fierceness that startled her. "Science is data, yes. But also people." An alarm trilled softly in the lab. B's head snapped up. She checked a feed on her tablet and went whiter than paper. 6 men at the door, she said. Bad shoes. Worse patience. There was no panic, only a falling silent like a held breath. Rui flicked switches. Lights shifted. Walls slid. Elena realized he had built the lab like a musician builds a set, rooms that could become other rooms with a touch. "Basement," B said. "They have a warrant signed by a friend of a friend. Our friends will stall. Not forever." They descended into a space designed for recovery, concrete, solid, humming with backup power. Rui pulled up the release dashboard. "We can go now," he said. "We will lose the luxury of escort. We will win the truth." Elena looked at Daniel. In that moment, the noises above, raised voices, a fist on metal, were like an old world moving through its last, loud habits. "Do it," she said. Daniel nodded and reached for the key. Then froze. "What?" Rui demanded. Daniel held up a hand for quiet. Elena heard nothing but her own heart. Then she heard it. Something like scratching inside the wall. Not from the stairs. From the conduit. Rui swore softly. "They found the fiber trunk." "Can you reroute?" Elena asked. "Only if I break something I wanted to keep." "Which I will." He pulled a lever. Somewhere, a panel gave way with a sound like a heavy book falling. The screens hiccuped, then resolved. Rui smiled, a baring of teeth. "All right. One last step." He lifted his hand toward Elena, not quite touching hers, a benediction without pretense. "You started this." "No," she said. "Illness started it. We refused to agree." Her hands moved, sure as they had in the lab in Leiden, sure as they had on nights when no one would help and she had to be many things at once. She authenticated, signed, breathed. The button was not dramatic. Its click was small and tender. On the screen, the cascade opened like a throat swallowing fear. One by one the repositories lit, then mirrored, then stabilized. The dead man switch woke and stretched and looked around, pleased. The clinic package pinged 3 co-ops, then 5. Annika's name appeared in the corner of one panel with a single word, filed. The testimonies landed. A hash confirmed ancestry and another confirmed intent. Above them, the basement door's hinges complained. The world was arriving, loud and late. "They'll still try to bury it," Daniel said, eyes on the map as if it were a weather chart. "Let them shovel," Rui said, voice shaking for the first time. "We seeded the storm." The hinges failed. Boots on concrete. B stepped forward, the kind of quiet that looks like peace but isn't. "Time to go, friends." "Where?" Elena asked, her body remembering running. Rui handed her a hard case, lighter than it looked. "To people," he said. "You've given the world the cure. Now you need to give it the story." Elena wanted to argue, she always did, about data standing on its own legs. But she saw the shape of it. The counterfeit packet, the smear, the handcuffs, the word terror with its precision edges. Science was not only laboratory, it was allegiance. They left by a corridor that smelled faintly of oranges and old flowers. On a landing, Elena stopped and looked back. Rui stood in the doorway, shoulders square, eyes bright. "You won't be alone," he said. "I built this to outlast us." "Don't be a hero," Daniel told him. Rui grinned, the expression of a man who had already chosen. Too late. They reached the street that was not the street it had been when they entered. Lisbon's morning had arrived while they were building a different day. People walked dogs, bought bread, flirted without meaning to. Elena thought of Merrick, of Iona, of a cottage with a kettle that walked across a table when the wind blew wrong. At the corner, a woman stepped from a doorway. Elena recognized her from photographs. Nadia Ferris, the journalist who had messaged with Elena months ago, when it had still seemed possible to win by being obvious. Dr. Moritz, Nadia said, voice low. Is it real? It is, Elena said, and felt something lift off her chest that she had not known was there. And it's everywhere now. They will call it dangerous. Call me naive. But they will also have to call people who can read a chart and a heart. She looked past Nadia, at the tiled wall catching light. I will speak. And then I will sleep. Nadia's smile was quick and human. Let's get you somewhere safe enough for an unsafe day. As they moved, Elena reached for Daniel's hand. He took it without looking, a habit written in a language the body learns when the head is busy. Behind them, somewhere inside the lab, a door slammed and voices rose. Ahead of them, a city became witness. On Nadia's phone, messages began to stack like urgent bricks. We're seeing it. Is this verified? Our clinic has the mirror. We need someone on the record. Can you talk now? Elena's mouth was dry. I can talk, she said. Not yet, Daniel murmured. In 20 minutes. With witnesses. He gestured to a building that looked like nothing, which meant it was probably important. In there. They crossed the street. A scooter skimmed past, leaving a ribbon of laughter. Elena squeezed his hand once, hard enough that he looked at her finally. What? He asked. If we lose each other, she said, voice steady in a way her heart wasn't, we meet where the cliff splits. Even if it takes years. He nodded, the promise settling into the bones of the day. At the cleft, they stepped into the building's shadow and up its narrow stairs. On a table in a room that once housed sewing machines, Nadia set out 3 glasses of water like offerings. She closed the shutters to keep out long lenses and opened her notebook. Ready? She asked. Elena looked at the door. She looked at Daniel. She looked at the world, heart beating at her wrists. Above the roofs, alarms began, near and far, like a city tuning itself to a new key. Ready, Elena said. She began to speak. And far away, in a lighthouse that had been built to teach ships where the rocks were, a woman with wind-tangled hair laughed once, sharp as a gull's cry, as she watched a new light bloom on a screen. The light of something gone too many places to ever be put back. Outside the shuttered room, the street was ordinary on purpose. Inside, history leaned forward, listening. The interview was supposed to last 30 minutes. It went on for nearly 3 hours. Nadia Ferris recorded everything, her pen scratching across the page even as 2 small cameras captured Elena from different angles. Daniel stayed in the corner, silent, scanning the room for any sign they were being watched. Outside, Lisbon's morning unfurled like nothing unusual was happening. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery below, a man arguing cheerfully with a delivery driver, the ring of a tram bell. But inside the small, shuttered room, Elena's words were a breach in the dam. She began with the science, explaining Regenera in the clearest terms possible without diluting its rigor. She described the trials, the patients, the cellular regeneration, the stability breakthrough. Then she moved to the opposition. The officials in The Hague, the veiled threats, the sabotage, the black SUV outside her cottage. She spoke of Merrick, of Iona, of the lighthouse. She didn't cry, though her throat ached when she mentioned them. Finally, she told Nadia about Lisbon, the false packet, the cascade, Rui's last grin before they left. Do you realize, Nadia asked, her voice quiet, that by naming these officials and agencies, you're placing yourself directly in their crosshairs? I've been in their crosshairs for a long time, Elena said simply. The difference is now I'm visible. And so is the cure. They can destroy me. They can't destroy it. Nadia sat back, studying her. And what do you hope happens next? Elena hesitated. The scientist in her wanted to say peer review, mass production, global distribution. But she knew better. I hope people start asking the right questions, she said. I hope someone's mother, someone's child, someone's best friend is saved because of this. And I hope those in power remember that they serve the living, not the ledger. Nadia nodded once. That's your closing line. By the time the interview ended, the first wave of public reaction was already cresting. Clinics in Spain, Kenya, and India confirmed they had received the package. A respected biomedical journal tweeted a link to the mirrored files, adding, "Initial review suggests this is authentic. Peer commentary incoming." And then came the pushback. An official statement from the Dutch Ministry of Health dismissed the release as premature and irresponsible. A coalition of pharmaceutical companies issued a joint warning against unverified medical claims, though several quietly began testing the formula themselves. Anonymous accounts flooded social media with doubts, conspiracy theories, and outright fabrications. But the testimonies started trickling in, too. Patients from Elena's early trials, doctors who had witnessed the effects firsthand, even skeptical researchers who had downloaded the files and admitted, grudgingly, that the science was sound. By noon, Elena's name was on every major news outlet in Europe. They didn't stay in Nadia's safe room long. Within hours, word reached them that a warrant for Elena's preventive detention had been issued in The Hague. The charge was vague: threat to public health through unauthorized dissemination of biological agents. Daniel read it on his phone and snorted. "They're calling your cure a biological weapon. It's a pattern," Nadia said grimly. "If they can't kill the data, they kill the messenger." So they moved again, this time with Nadia's help, slipping through Lisbon's backstreets to an old tram depot converted into an artists' co-op. There, a retired broadcast engineer named Salvatore had set up a pirate feed. He offered them 2 hours of untraceable satellite time to stream Elena's interview globally. It was risky. The more she appeared on camera, the easier she was to track. But they all agreed. The story needed to spread faster than the smear campaign. They went live just after dusk. Salvatore's improvised studio was a tangle of cables, lights, and mismatched chairs. Daniel adjusted the mic, his hands steady, and gave her a look that was part encouragement, part warning. Elena spoke again, this time directly to the public. She explained the science, the suppression, the danger of allowing profit to outweigh human life. She named the places where Regenera had already begun helping patients. She urged scientists everywhere to test, verify, and share. And she ended with the same line she had given Nadia. Those in power must remember that they serve the living, not the ledger. The feed went dark. Salvatore grinned. That will leave a mark. It did. Over the next 48 hours, the cure's spread became unstoppable. Download mirrors appeared faster than they could be taken down. Grassroots labs, some in universities, some in basements, posted photos of early synthesis tests. Physicians' networks began exchanging notes on dosage and safety. The opposition shifted tactics. Instead of denying the cure, they began claiming it was unsafe without official oversight, that Elena's recklessness could cost lives. They paraded experts on state television to cast doubt, many of them with ties to pharmaceutical boards. And then came the personal attacks. An old photo of Elena at a university protest was splashed across tabloids, labeled "radical activist." A doctored video appeared online showing her shouting in anger at a health conference, the audio a crude fake. Someone leaked her old emails, twisting academic disagreements into accusations of misconduct. Daniel watched it all with a tightening jaw. They're trying to make you untouchable. Not just legally, socially. They want anyone who stands with you to look dangerous by association. I've been called worse, Elena said, though the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her. 3 days after the Lisbon broadcast, they got word from Rui. His lab had been raided. He escaped, but much of his equipment was seized. B was safe, hiding in the countryside. Merrick, they learned from a coded message, was alive, in a holding facility somewhere in Eastern Europe. Iona had gone silent. That last silence hit Elena hardest. She found herself staring out at the Atlantic, imagining the lighthouse empty, the wind battering its shutters. Daniel put a hand on her shoulder. We can't save everyone at once. No, she said, but we can keep this alive. And so they kept moving. Madrid, Marseille, Geneva. Each stop meant more interviews, more quiet meetings with sympathetic scientists, more encrypted calls. Every city was a different shade of danger. The breakthrough came unexpectedly in Marseille. At a small medical conference, a coalition of independent clinics announced they had verified Regenera's safety and effectiveness in a limited set of patients. Their statement was precise, cautious, but unambiguous. This treatment works. It must be made available. The press picked it up instantly. A video of a young man walking unassisted for the first time in years went viral. Donations to open-source labs surged. Even some mid-level officials began breaking ranks, urging formal approval. The tide was turning, but tides bring undertow. That night, as Elena and Daniel left the conference, a van swerved toward them in the narrow street. Daniel shoved her out of the way. They both hit the cobblestones hard. The van roared past, never slowing. Elena's arm throbbed, scraped raw. Daniel's cheek was bloodied where he'd hit the ground. "That wasn't random," he said, his breath ragged. "No," Elena agreed. "They're done with warnings." 2 weeks later, they were in Geneva for a closed-door meeting with the World Health Organization. Elena presented the data again, this time to an audience that could, in theory, legitimize Regenera on a global scale. Some delegates were enthusiastic, others wary, a few openly hostile. In the corridor afterward, a quiet voice stopped her. Dr. Moritz. She turned to see a man she didn't recognize, early 50s, sharp suit, eyes tired. "You don't know me," he said. "But my wife was one of your trial patients. She's alive because of you. I can't say much here. But I will push this from inside." It was a small thing, maybe even empty words. But Elena held onto it. Change, she knew, often began in whispers. By the end of summer, the cure had crossed a threshold. Too many labs had synthesized it, too many patients had benefited, too many stories had gone public. Even the most determined governments couldn't suppress it completely without revealing the depth of their corruption. The Hague quietly dropped its warrant. Pharmaceutical companies began announcing new breakthrough treatments, thinly disguised versions of Regenera, while insisting they had developed them independently. It didn't matter. People knew. Elena and Daniel finally stopped running. They returned to Scotland, not to the cottage that had been sold, but to a small house near the sea. They kept working, advising open labs, refining the formula, mentoring young scientists. One evening, as they walked along the cliff path, Daniel stopped and looked out at the water. "Do you think it was worth it?" Elena followed his gaze. The horizon was lit by the last orange of sunset. "Every risk, every scar," she said. "Because somewhere, someone is still alive who wouldn't be. And because they didn't win." He smiled faintly. "And what now?" "Now?" She slipped her hand into his. "We find the others. Merrick, Iona, Rui. We bring them home." Months later, Elena stood on a different shore, waiting. The wind carried the smell of salt and kelp. A small boat rounded the rocks, and there she was. Iona, hair wild, eyes fierce, grinning like she'd never been gone. "You kept the light on," Iona said. Elena laughed, pulling her into an embrace. "Always." They walked up from the pier together, Daniel falling into step beside them. The world was still dangerous. The fight for truth would never end. But for now, the cure lived, and so did they. And somewhere, in 1,000 labs and clinics across the globe, Regenera was working quietly, cell by cell, patient by patient, turning what had once been impossible into something beautifully, stubbornly real.